Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be moderator for today's panel. My name is Suzanne Adely. I am a longtime organizer in the Arab American community in the United States. I live in Lenape territory in what is known as New York in the northeast of the United States. I am by day a labor advocate as a co-director of an organization called the Food Chain Workers Alliance. I am also a human rights lawyer and currently the president-elect of the National Lawyers Guild and a member of CASI, the Committee of Anti-Imperialists in Solidarity with Iran, that's hosting today's webinar. Just want to speak for a minute about CASI, which and we'll share with you information about CASI in the chat as well. The Committee of Anti-Imperialists in Solidarity with Iran opposes US imperialism against Iran and is united against US intervention in Iran, Iraq, and throughout the world. We are a group of international activists, Iranian and otherwise, located in the United States and Canada. And we consider ourselves part of anti-imperialist and anti-war movements throughout the world. We support the right of people and nations to build their own societies free from the terror of imperialist war and violence. Today's webinar is titled Anti-Imperialism, Policing, and Decolonization After the Trump Presidency. And it is the last webinar in a series of panels that we have held on the topic of US imperialism since earlier this year. And it's really terrific to see so many people have joined us today. And I think that that speaks really to the amount of respect and admiration that this dynamic group of speakers have within our movements. But it also, I believe, speaks to a great need that many of us feel to engage collectively in really informative and critical discussions about imperialism, which is too often absent from movement spaces in the United States. Before I introduce the first speaker, I wanted to just let you know about some upcoming events that CASI will be organizing. In January, we will be starting a workshop series entitled Iran and the Arab Region. And the first workshop in that series will take place at the end of January. And it will include Richard Falk, Sassan Fayez-Manesh, and Vera Ameli. Our second workshop will be in March on the history of Iranian and Palestinian solidarity. And please look out for these events on our website and our Facebook page, which we'll share with you in the chat. And if you haven't already, please sign up for announcements on our website. Okay. So our first speaker this afternoon is Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who is a historian and longtime activist in anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movements, and author of 15 books, including an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. She will be speaking on US continental imperialism and the fiscal military state. Roxanne, welcome.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank everyone who is speaking and who is tuning in to us. So continental imperialism is probably something that many of you have not encountered that much or before. So I want to try to present I'm a historian, so I think the history is very important. It's very important how it behaves right now, the United States imperialism, but this is sort of a background of the peculiarity of US imperialism. Because the United States was founded as the first capitalist state, capital was in the form of enslaved African bodies, both as a commodity and labor, and land, real estate. By 1850, the United States was the leading economic powerhouse in the world, the largest GDP, the largest reserves. having established the global center of the cotton industry and expanded its claimed territory to the Pacific. In 1846, the United States Army, Marines, and Texas Rangers invaded Mexico from land and from sea, and for nearly 2 years devastated the countryside and provincial villages and cities, finally occupying and terrorizing Mexico City for 2 months, forcing the Mexican government to cede the northern half of Mexico to the United States. The US thereby reached the founding fathers' stated goal of expanding US sovereignty to the Pacific with direct access to Asia. It took the US military 40 more years to crush the armed resistance of the indigenous peoples between the Mississippi and the Pacific, and between the Canadian border and the newly drawn Mexico-US border. This 100 Years' War against the indigenous nations that started at the founding of the United States constituted continental imperialism. Without missing a beat, the US moved to conquer and control the Pacific and the Caribbean, then the world. There has never been a day in United States history since its founding without war against a foreign nation, even during the Civil War. Indian affairs were central in creating the Constitution and the imperialist US state. The elite founders committed themselves to the expropriation of the indigenous territories bordering the initial 13 states as the first step of the continental control they envisioned. Constitutional law professor Gregory Ablasky writes that the settlers' libertarian streak ran only as far as self-interest, for they welcomed a strengthened federal state as long as it was an imperialist one, focused on projecting power against the native peoples rather than against its citizens. The Hamiltonians would solve the problem of Indian affairs by committing the federal state to empowering, not restraining, the settlers' mass movements westwards. For his analysis of the Constitution, Ablasky borrowed historian Max Edling's term, fiscal military state. Edling took the term from the historical literature on British state formation, in which fiscal military state refers to a state primarily designed for war. Edling writes that the United States did not adopt the British model wholesale. Rather, the Constitution created a national government that was light and inconspicuous, but which held the full powers of the fiscal military state in reserve. US historians make much of the fact that the founders did not create a large standing army, and thereby they ignore the first 100 years of US military history, except for the Civil War, as irrelevant. But the initial importance of the role of the military was for the gradual confiscation of the continent, not for engagements with European organized standing armies. This meant counterinsurgency against resistant indigenous nations, not regiments of troops. Military historian John Grenier writes that the US military depended on raising and destroying enemy villages and fields, killing enemy women and children, raiding settlements for captives, intimidating and brutalizing enemy non-combatants, and assassinating enemy leaders in unlimited war and in irregular war. This US way of war was a continuation and enhancement of the British settlers' wars against indigenous nations to take the 13 colonies over a period of 180 years prior to US independence. Unlimited wars against native nations remained a constant to 1890. This military aspect of the fiscal military state was the fiscal military state created by the Constitution. Almost every war that the US carries out overseas or occupation turns into counterinsurgency, even if it starts with regiments. The founders and settlers of the United States were unapologetic imperialists, chops off the old block of British imperialism, but with the added conceit of being an empire for liberty, as Thomas Jefferson conceived the future. They were proud to be the first republic to form an empire. Historian David Reynolds writes that Jefferson believed the US empire was destined to assume the responsibility to spread freedom around the world, starting with the North American continent and intervening abroad. US foreign policy was stamped with this concept and has provided the ideological motivation. The Northwest Land Ordinance, which preceded the Constitution, created a unique land system, turning every piece of land into a commodity. Land itself was the most important exchange commodity for the accumulation of capital. The Land Ordinance was a plan for the first fully developed design of settler colonialism, which was embedded in the design of the fiscal military state. The Northwest Ordinance designed how the land from the Appalachian Mountains up to the Mississippi River was to be commodified and sold to settlers. This was implemented by surveyors' chains, each 22-yard length. The measuring began in the unconquered Ohio Territory, which was like 5 states that now exist, not just the state of Ohio. Lines were drawn on the land. Lines were drawn on the land to form a grid of perfect rectangles marked by iron bars and the occasional brass plate cemented onto a masonry base. Each of the rectangles had its own map reference, and as the US Imperium expanded, the grid eventually reached the Pacific coast and stretched between Mexico and British North America. The lines on the land conquered the natural topography before the US armies and settlers conquered the people whose land it belonged to. This was the implementation of the fiscal military state. The state made for war in order to appropriate property to build the capitalist state, with fee simple real estate the basis of capital accumulation, and then to control and dominate the world. The process is important not only for understanding how settler colonialism defines the United States and all of its institutions, and the character of its imperialism, but also, as Mahmoud Mamdani has documented, all of the defining institutions of settler colonialism as practiced in the 19th and 20th centuries were first developed in North America. The US homeland was a prototype used for the Nazi concentration camp, the South African apartheid regime's reserves, and Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories. It also defines US continental imperialism that built the fiscal military state that could dominate the world. What does this historical reality mean for developing an effective anti-imperialist movement in the United States? As the late historian William Appleman Williams wrote in Empire as a Way of Life, there have been very few US anti-imperialists and no real sustained anti-imperialist movement in the United States. As long as the indigenous peoples are erased from US history, there will be no strategic basis for building an anti-US imperialist movement in this country. And this is a responsibility of the left. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. Before I introduce the next speaker, I just wanted to make a note that we will be having a question and answer period after all the speakers have completed their presentations. And we do have a question and answer box, which is useful for questions that the panelists could actually directly answer within the box. But you could also put your questions in the chat box that Charlotte and I will look through in order to field some of those questions to our panelists. Okay, our next speaker is Toussaint Losier, who is a scholar and organizer currently teaching at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Toussaint is a co-founder and former vice chairman of the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. He is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, a coalition of individuals and organizations that seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace position of the radical Black movement. Toussaint, welcome.
Wonderful, appreciate that welcome. Want to thank all the folks who helped make this event possible, and share my appreciation for the wisdom that the other panelists have already shared, and looking forward to what the others have to say. I just want to note a couple things, but from the outset, just really want to suggest that kind of building off of the last presentation, that much of what I want to talk about has to do with really the question of demilitarization, and really the ways in which that's a focus of a lot of the work of the Black Alliance for Peace. The Alliance is a people-centered human rights project that is opposed to war, repression, and imperialism. And as was noted earlier, seeks to redevelop this anti-war, anti-imperialist positions of the Black radical tradition. It's made up of individuals and organizations committed to these principles and has spoken out forcefully in opposition to U.S. war policies over the, really since the first years of its existence. I want to say in particular that for several years we've made U.S. aggression against Iran in the general, sort of put it in the general context of concerns related to the new forms of imperialist aggression that the U.S. has increasingly deployed in the form of sanctions. Earlier this year, the Alliance participated in the January 25th Global Day of Action against the war in Iran, U.S. war on Iran. And through the course of this year, some of our members have been at the forefront of raising the slogan that sanctions kill within the anti-war movement and on the left more broadly, in response to the question of sanctions not only against Iran, but also Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, and a host of other countries, and really trying to push back against the ways in which we've seen some of those on the left kind of fall back onto sanctions as a way of thinking about how to push for different aspects of how U.S. foreign policy could respond to human rights abuses in other countries. And I'll touch on that a little bit at the end during the question and answer session at this time. I want to say that part of our mission as Black anti-imperialists and internationalists is to really make the connection between U.S. and Western European imperialist war agenda, and how the war is also being waged against Black working class people and against the working class in general here in the United States. We know that the permanent war agenda requires the support from the public, as well as its operation through the containment of forces opposed to this agenda. And the latter really manifests itself in increasing state repression against working class Black and brown people in particular in the US. And it's really this focus on the wars abroad and the wars at home that has been a key aspect of what has brought those in the Black Alliance for Peace together. And we've seen the ways in which these wars at home have manifested themselves, particularly in the ways in which different government agencies have been responsible for militarizing police forces across the country. We've seen an uptick in the training of U.S. police forces by the Israeli government. And we believe that it's important for people to know that these developments, to know about these developments and to connect them to what's going on here domestically with the ongoing permanent war agenda worldwide. For African people, this means in particular, looking at U.S. wars launched on the African continent with the creation and expansion of the U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM. And I want to just talk a little bit about AFRICOM because it's an important part of U.S. foreign policy that we recognize is not very widely understood. So AFRICOM is one of the 11 unified combatant commands of the U.S. Department of Defense. And it's a relatively new creation, starting out of kind of initiatives that emerged within the Clinton administration, where we saw the Africa Crisis Response Initiative as sort of the military arm of U.S. Neoliberal and neocolonial interventions in Africa, and the sort of more policy-focused, structural adjustment-focused, economic policy-focused element of this intervention was the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and really the ways in which this initial effort, beginning in the 1990s, really highlights the way in which this military, this kind of push for further militarization of the African continent that AFRICOM is very much a part of, has gone alongside efforts to sort of push for further a push of a further neoliberal agenda, and to really use the sort of military force as the sort of iron fist that goes alongside some of the more kind of the soft power elements of U.S. hegemony on the continent. This continued up into the announcement of the creation of AFRICOM in 2007, and its founding on October 1st, 2008. And AFRICOM really brings together the sort of responsibilities that had been a part of three other U.S. military commands, particularly the Euro Command, CENTCOM, which deals primarily with West Asia and is based in Tampa, Florida, and the Pacific Command, which is primarily focused on the Pacific Rim. And essentially, different parts of the African continent were under those different commands, and AFRICOM brought those different commands together such that it has responsibility for military matters on 54 countries on the African continent, save for Egypt, in part because of Egypt's key role in its relationship with Israel and its partnership in terms of helping to maintain the oppression of the Palestinian people. And we've seen that AFRICOM has placed a priority on strengthening partnerships with key African governments that have helped to promote neoliberal policies that exploit African peoples and the resources of the continent. This is particularly in regards to Museveni in Uganda, Deby of Chad, the leadership in Ethiopia, Kagame in Rwanda. And through these partners, have really helped to push for further militarization on the continent in a way in which many of the ongoing conflicts that we've seen break out, whether that's the civil conflict that's taking place in Ethiopia at this moment, with the central government's attack on the northern Tigray region, whether we see the way in which there's been further intensification of the occupation of Western Sahara. Much of this military activity has connected in some ways to the influence of AFRICOM on the continent, the push for further militarization, and efforts to undermine campaigns for peace and pushes for demilitarization, in large part by regional bodies and more continental bodies like the African Union. I want to wind up by just highlighting a couple different points. One of the key elements that it's important for people to know about the story of AFRICOM is that from its inception, it was largely opposed by African governments on the continent as a large part, really largely to do with the way in which young people, progressive organizations mobilized to prevent AFRICOM from gaining a foothold on the continent. If you look at the Pentagon's own information, there's something like 28, 29 military bases that the United States has on the African continent. But none of those has served as a home base for AFRICOM, and in large part, many of those are small military installations. And in a large regard, we saw just recently, last month, that the U.S. Government announced that AFRICOM was actually going to be returning back to the U.S. Central Command headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany, and was actually going to be consolidated with the Central Command. And in many ways, this is a victory in that it represents the ways in which a decade of activism and a decade of efforts to prevent AFRICOM from gaining a stable foothold on the African continent have been pushed back and really hasn't been able to solidify itself in much of the ways that many of us had feared going back a dozen years ago. At the same time, that doesn't mean that AFRICOM hasn't had a devastating impact. Really, the watershed moment for AFRICOM was the 2011 US-led attack on Libya. And it was AFRICOM that actually played a role in spearheading the imposition of a no-fly zone, the missile attacks on Libya that were then handed over to NATO and led to the downfall of the Libyan government and the assassination of Gaddafi. And that destruction not only had an impact on Libya in particular, but broadly has had a disastrous impact in terms of destabilizing much of northern and western Africa. And we are particularly mindful of the ways in which this real push for further militarization, that has been a key aspect of AFRICOM, has been very much intertwined with the further militarization of U.S. police forces here. It really, going back to 1997 and that year's Defense Authorization Act, we've seen this 1033 program that has been a key part of the Pentagon's efforts to take military weaponry and provide it to local, state, and tribal law enforcement authorities. How that's been a key element of the efforts to repress a variety of different social movement mobilizations, whether we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, whether we're talking about the No DAPL movement. And it really is incumbent on us to fight this militarization, not only because of the important ways in which it helps to undergird U.S. imperialism abroad, but the ways in which it helps to shore up the U.S. empire at home. And so the Black Alliance for Peace has taken up a U.S. out of Africa, shut down AFRICOM campaign. We have several key demands. One, for the Congressional Black Caucus to oppose AFRICOM and conduct hearings on AFRICOM's impacts on the African continent. 2, the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Africa. 3, the demilitarization of the African continent. And 4, the closure of U.S. bases throughout the world. And in making these demands, we've really looked to partner with organizations that are looking to rebuild the anti-war movement, to challenge U.S. imperialism, and to note the ways in which U.S. military intervention, its support for the military efforts of different governments in Africa, and more generally, the way in which a kind of a trend towards militarization has impacted U.S. foreign relations more generally when it comes to the continent of Africa. That those are elements that we need to do a much better job of educating the public about, and at every opportunity that they present themselves, opposing them. And this includes supporting the NSARS campaign that is dealt directly with the militarization of the Nigerian police forces, to oppose the annexation of Western Sahara by the Moroccan government, and to demand an end to military hostilities in Ethiopia, to challenge U.S. involvement in Somalia. That these are ways in which we need to be active around challenging the ways in which military, the militarization of the management of our foreign policy, of life in general, is a key aspect of what the U.S. government has helped to promote, and we need to be about opposing. So I'll leave it there for now and look forward to further conversation during the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Toussaint. Okay, our next speaker, very happy that he was able to join us. Our next speaker is Zhun Xu, who is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College, CUNY, go CUNY, and Howard University. His recent book is From Commune to Capitalism: How China's Peasants Lost Collective Farming and Gained Urban Poverty. Welcome, Zhun.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for for all those who made this event possible. So I'm going to briefly discuss the U.S.-China relationship at this point. To understand this relationship between the two countries, we don't need to look very far. As we can see from the pages of New York Times or Washington Post, we can see that the attitudes of the U.S. mainstream towards China has noticeably changed in recent years. Previously, for most part, China was something from far away that needs to be and can be saved by peaceful education of the West. Now China suddenly becomes something that's uneducable and needs to be taught its place in the world by whatever means possible. And this change in the attitudes didn't start with Trump, but the aggression against China has indeed become more explicit in the last few years. Even though there are so many things, we can see that Trump or the establishment Republicans or the liberals that they would disagree with, but they have reached quite a consensus, actually a holy alliance regarding containing China. And it's not just the capitalists and the U.S. working people. They also often being misguided by the mainstream media. And sometimes they also think that China is to be blamed for either the loss of jobs or the tragic, the deaths from the pandemic. In a lot of ways, China is a natural scapegoat when U.S. capitalism has a crisis. China is a large country that has a communist party in power, and it is in Asia with the history of being a colony or semi-colony. And U.S. has a strong anti-communist tradition. It also has a very strong racist tradition, and they work very well together on the case of China. And so now with the Biden administration, with the crisis going on, I think it would make a lot of sense for them to largely continue the anti-China initiatives from the Trump era. I think it's worth pointing out that on the economic level, U.S. and Chinese capitalists, they largely play complementary and not competing roles in the global economy. In general, the U.S. has monopoly on science and high science and technologies, and China mostly produces or assembles different kind of commodities. for the US and others. Imperialism, in theory, that ultimately involves a transfer of surplus from the periphery to the imperialist center. And obviously, US has been benefiting a lot from that relationship. And despite China's fast growth in recent years, it has not been in a position to extract such profits. So China is best described as a semi-peripheral country in the global capitalism. And China joined the capitalist world system in about 30, 40 years ago. And that process has brought huge damage to the Chinese working class, politically and also economically. But the Chinese capitalists have gained so much by basically working under the leadership of the US capitalists. For the most part, the Chinese elites are very self-conscious that they have benefited immensely from the current division of labor in the global economy, and they have a strong desire to maintain the status quo. The consensus among the Chinese elites make them oftentimes more avid than many others in defending US imperialism. And overall, they have not shown an ambition or a conscious plan to work against the international order dictated by the US and other imperialist countries. This is why I think the Chinese elites were quite unprepared for a change in the US-China relationship. They thought that they were already part of the US family a few years ago. And some, after the trade war and all the other kind of conflicts, some were very afraid among the top level leadership that they argued it must be something that China has done so badly that we need to change. For example, they argued, let's open up the market even more. Let's get rid of the industrial policies, and let's deregulate more, and let's get rid of the capital control. So the international capital might be happier, and the Wall Street might be happier, and eventually the US might be happier too. And so I think in that sense, China has seen some unprecedented speed of opening up its financial sector, for example, in the last 2 years. But I think we should be clear that neither the US aggressions against China or any other country in the world, nor opening up to Wall Street, and both are quite, I would say, desperate actions and will not address the contradictions of capitalism in the US and China. It is also unlikely to improve much of the relationship between the US and China. But it can seriously cause further troubles to the working people everywhere. After all, the world capitalism is in clear decay. And that decay has caused the paranoia, anxiety, and hatred among those in charge of it. The international leftists should actively fight against the madness, the US imperialism, and the passive or even active support of US imperialism among the so-called leftists or liberals in this country, and especially in the West. And we should explore the path towards revolutionary changes in both the center and the periphery of world capitalism. So thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Zhun, for your contribution. I think that all of us who organized the panel thought that it was very, very important to include your presentation and to kind of really strengthen our understanding of US-China relations. And so we're really happy that you could join us. Our next speaker, who will focus on Iran, is Navid Farnia, who is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of History at Wake Forest University. His research examines the relationship between racial oppression and US imperialism. His book manuscript is entitled National Liberation in an Imperialist World, Race in the Modern US National Security State. Welcome, Navid.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to the organizers for putting this together and for inviting me to participate. What I want to do today is to open my presentation with a quote from the Guyanese scholar and revolutionary Walter Rodney, and I'll explain why in a minute. But Rodney says, quote, "Fascism is a product of capitalism in crisis. It was an attempt to rescue the essence of the capitalist exploitative system while pretending to be representative of all interests, such as those of the working class, the bourgeoisie, and the church. Fascism," Rodney continues, "is only a more reactionary version of capitalism." Okay, so only a more reactionary version of capitalism. So the basis of my talk for today will be extending Rodney's point to argue that fascism embodies the ruling class's recognition that the liberal structures upholding capitalist accumulation are failing due to the scarcity of global capital. So fascism is the consolidation of state power and global capital through coercive means. In this talk, I'm going to center US-Iran relations to substantiate this point, and I'll focus on these relations since the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, in 2015. But before I do that, I want to provide some political and economic context by focusing on both the domestic and foreign policies of successive US presidents to help frame my discussion of Iran. This context will help us to better understand US policy toward Iran and why I think the crisis in capital and intensified state violence may ultimately lead to full-fledged open war, whether in Iran or elsewhere in the world. Now, in a recent historical sense, the transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump best reflects the liberal crisis engendered by the combination of increasing economic scarcity and ongoing racial violence. Economically, Obama continued a decades-long trend initiated by his predecessors of embracing privatization and supporting big business. But Obama's economic policies also came during a time of global economic downturn. Much like preceding administrations, the Obama government had an expansionist economic outlook. In terms of foreign policy, the Obama government's attempts to normalize relations with Iran in the form of the JCPOA not only aimed to halt Iran's nuclear development, but it also entailed opening Iran to foreign economic interests. One of the understated and now forgotten aspects of the nuclear deal was the economic opportunity that it presented for foreign investment in Iran. The following quote is from a Press TV article in September 2015. Quote, "International companies are anxiously looking to Iran's introduction of new oil projects in the terms under which the oil-rich industry, or under which the oil-rich country would award them for development," unquote. The Obama government's policies are also important here because they provide us with a starting point for understanding what the Biden government might do. And I'll get to the latter in a bit. In effect, the Obama government used diplomacy and soft power in conjunction with covert military and intelligence activities to subsidize global capital and at the same time undermine Iranian alliances with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Syria. But the Trump government reversed course. So the question is why? This brings me back to fascism and liberalism. Even amid an economic downturn, Obama represented the triumph of colorblind liberalism, or the idea that structural racism no longer exists in the post-civil rights era. Liberals championed Obama as the culmination of the Black freedom struggle. But of course, this logic could not sustain itself given the rampant and ongoing police violence against Black women and men, girls and boys, while Obama was in power. Moreover, the colorblind logic could not sustain itself given the reality that banks' practices of preying upon Black and brown communities helped lead to the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis in the first place, a crisis in which Obama responded by subsidizing big business. In other words, the same logic of colorblind liberalism that championed Obama's rise contained within itself the racial contradictions animating US society, which ultimately led to a fascist reaction. Thus, whereas liberals shunned racial discourse in order to conceal structural racism, conservatives embraced it. Using history as their model, Trump and his aides understood that racism could be a galvanizing force among the white public in the United States. Richard Nixon used this model during his presidency in the late 1960s and early 70s, and so did Ronald Reagan in the 80s. Nixon emerged in the context of Black power in the US war in Vietnam and aimed to criminalize all domestic resistance. In doing so, the Nixon campaign and administration based itself on a white and particularly middle-class consensus. The following quote by John Ehrlichman, an aide in the Nixon government, speaks to how the government approached both so-called crises, the crisis of the Vietnam War and the crisis of Black resistance. Quote, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate with, the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So again, using this crisis to mobilize a consensus, a racial consensus, an anti-left consensus as well. Reagan expanded upon this white consensus by not only attacking Black people in a social and political sense, the war on drugs is a prime example, but also economically in an attempt to dismantle the welfare state. Reagan mobilized racism to enshrine neoliberal policies, or in other words, economic policies that included deregulation of big business, embracing free trade and open markets, slashing public spending, and diminishing the power of unions. The Reagan government also reinforced neoliberal regimes around the world, from Chile to apartheid South Africa, while waging covert wars against leftist forces in Central America, the Caribbean, Southern Africa, and Central Asia. The Trump campaign utilized this history to build a white racial consensus based on anti-left rhetoric, but it also did so according to its own historical context. The Trump government emerged in part by positioning itself in opposition to Black Lives Matter and the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And it also ascended at a time when xenophobia was boiling over in the white popular imagination, and while the Obama government was operating under a policy of mass deportation. Equally as important though, Trump emerged in the context when most people in the United States had not recovered from the economic crisis. Neoliberalism had decimated the working class in the United States, and the economic crisis not only highlighted this reality, but the government's response reinforced the existing disparities. The Trump government responded in a unique way to the prevailing scarcity in capital, or what Walter Rodney would call capitalism in crisis. Rather than dismantling neoliberalism, the Trump government pursued economic consolidation at home while weaponizing neoliberalism as a tool of hard power abroad, which brings me back to Iran. The Trump campaign and subsequent administration attacked JCPOA at every turn and threatened to withdraw from the agreement if Iran did not make major concessions which were not outlined in the original agreement. When Iran predictably refused this unfavorable changing of terms, the US abandoned the JCPOA agreement, though Washington still aims to influence the agreement from the outside. The Trump government also instituted a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, using sanctions in order to undermine and destabilize the Iranian government. These sanctions were intentionally harsh and designed to reach Iran's general population. In April of this year, for instance, Washington pressured the International Monetary Fund to decline Iran's request for a loan to combat the coronavirus pandemic. Now, I use the word pressure lightly here since it understates the US's influence with the IMF. Iran was well known to be the hardest hit country in the region and one of the most urgent situations in the world at the time. Now, as an aside, we should bear in mind that the IMF has played a central role in neoliberal globalization in the last few decades. It has a long history of providing loans to third world countries, and the terms of those loans require governments to implement structural adjustment programs, which were mentioned earlier, that include encouraging foreign investment and slashing public spending on education, healthcare, and welfare, for instance. So in a rare case in which the IMF is not requiring neoliberal economic reforms as a stipulation for loan approval, Washington played a central role in denying such needed funds to Iran. Trump government officials have argued that if Iran were allowed to access IMF funds, Tehran would divert these funds to help its economy, quote, finance militants in the Middle East rather than on containing the pandemic. A Trump government official said, quote, Iranian officials have a long history of diverting funds allocated for humanitarian goods into their own pockets and to finance organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, or what this official called, quote, Iran's terrorist proxies. Moreover, the US's International Financial Institution Act states that the Secretary of the Treasury will direct its representatives in the international banks to, quote, use the voice and vote of the United States to oppose any loan or any use of funds for countries that the Secretary of State has determined are state sponsors of terrorism. Now, the terror designation is extremely important here because it links the economic manifestations of US power, the US's military and intelligence activities in the region, and their implications in international law. Now, I argued that it's a racialized designation. In April 2019, Washington designated Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. It was the first time in history that the US government had named part of another government as a terrorist organization. At the time, Trump said that the designation would, quote, significantly expand the scope and scale of our maximum pressure on the Iranian regime, end quote. In its public statement about the designation, the State Department singled out the Quds Force, a unit of the Revolutionary Guards led by Qasem Soleimani. A few months later, in October 2019, the Iranians reported that they had foiled a plot by Israel and Arab countries to assassinate Soleimani. This was a few months before the US successfully assassinated him in early January 2020. So all evidence points to the conclusion that the assassination of Soleimani was months in the making, at least, and marked an escalation of the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. The previous alleged assassination attempt against Soleimani reinforces this, but the terror designation is even more illuminating because of its ramifications in international law. Washington strategically calls its attacks against those it is deemed as terrorists as, quote, targeted killings as opposed to assassination. This distinction is important because while international law accounts for assassinations, it does not account for targeted killings of alleged terrorists. The term terror here refers not only to any, not to any individual or organization's actions, but rather who they are, what they represent, and what they might do in the future on the basis of their identity and suspected politics. In other words, the US government's terrorist designations are based on identity and ideology and not on actions. Anyone who opposes US power could plausibly be deemed a terrorist, which in turn legalizes any violence inflicted upon the person. So while the Department of the Treasury used the terrorism charge to deny Iran's request for IMF funding, the State Department has attempted to shed the US of international legal culpability for the Soleimani killing on the same terrorism basis. In this respect, we have to understand the discourse on terror in racial terms. To go back to Walter Rodney, the Trump government's demonization of Iran aims to generate a fascist racial consensus at home for the US's so-called war on terror. But this consensus also aims to obscure the acceleration of capitalist accumulation amid economic shortage. Ironically, the pandemic exposed the contradictions of capitalist accumulation, racial violence, and working class alienation to such an extent, they were exposed before, but the pandemic exposed them to such an extent that the US electorate ultimately voted Trump out of office for his failure to address the pandemic in any kind of effective way. The Biden government will attempt to resort back to the old and tired tropes of colorblind liberalism at home, but the reality is that the racial violence will continue as it has for centuries. And with economic conditions progressively worsening as well, and the government doing little about it, there will be more protests. Now, in terms of economic policy, and I'm close to wrapping up here, I remain skeptical that the Biden government will return the US to the JCPOA, just my personal opinion. Biden's presumed Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is known as an interventionist who supported US military action in Libya. And Blinken also wrote in 2019 that force can be, quote, a necessary adjunct to effective diplomacy. In Syria, we rightly sought to avoid another Iraq by not doing too much, but we made the opposite error of doing too little. Without bringing appropriate power to bear, no peace could be negotiated, much less imposed, end quote. Blinken then added, quote, we'll have to strike the right balance of modernization, readiness, asymmetric capabilities, and force structure. Based on these comments, the Biden government will likely aim to revamp the small wars pursued by the Obama government and continued under Trump, but the current crises may lead the US to an even more violent path, as it has already been the case under Trump. More than anything, the Biden government's goal in terms of foreign policy is restoring the US's hegemonic role vis-a-vis Europe. In September, Biden explained, quote, with the world at America's side, really speaking to Europe, a Biden administration will make it a priority to set Iran policy right. While the US remains the most powerful country in the world, and the Trump government attempts to flex that power and leverage its might to undermine and destabilize Iran, Washington does not have the ability to act alone, particularly against both Russia and China. Biden has stated that he would return to the deal, the JCPOA, as, quote, a starting point for follow-on negotiations. He added, with our allies, we will work to strengthen and extend the nuclear deal's provisions while also addressing other issues of concern. However, Tehran has rejected these terms or a need to renegotiate. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said, quote, we will not renegotiate a deal which we negotiated. And just today, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani reiterated this position, quote, we will not accept any preconditions from anybody. Neither is the JCPOA negotiable, nor can we set it out on a negotiation table and discuss it part by part. Either everyone will implement the JCPOA as it is, or they don't. If they do, we will too, end quote. Ultimately, however, the election of Joe Biden can only delay the inevitable, which is the decline of the US empire. This presents a scary potentiality in the short and intermediate term, because for fascism, war is the ultimate endgame. And barring resistance from the US public, war is a real possibility. The Trump government's demonization of Iran and Israel and the Gulf countries poking and prodding have aimed to entice Iran into open military conflict. And while this is a scary prospect for everyone in the world, war won't save the US empire. The Trump government has made the already existing contradictions both within US society and in US foreign policy so apparent that the resistance against police and military power and against the US in general will grow as Washington becomes more reactionary and violent. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. Okay, our next and last speaker before we go into discussion is Nick Estes. Nick is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He is an assistant professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. In 2014, he co-founded the Red Nation, an indigenous resistance organization. Estes is the author of the book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance, published by Verso 2019, which places into historical context the indigenous-led movement to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I believe that Nick has recently returned from Venezuela. Nick, welcome.
Thank you for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to the panel. The day after the Venezuelan National Assembly elections, former Bolivian President Evo Morales gave a speech in Caracas. The topic was about the dialogue of civilizations, a concept inspired by the former socialist prime minister Zapatero of Spain. There was no civilization, only invasion, Morales said of European conquest of Abiyala. When the imperialists strike, it's not solely against indigenous people, he said of the coup against his government last year. They strike against our model. The United States' relentless decades-long frontal assault of Venezuela is a testament to this statement. And most recently, those attempts have been aimed at eviscerating the legacy of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. With sanctions, a gas shortage, COVID-19, and a boycott by the opposition, the combined effects of a US hybrid war, only 31% of the Venezuelan electorate cast ballots on December 6th. But the party supporting President Maduro won 68% of the vote, or 253 seats of the 277 in the National Assembly. And prior to the election, the Trump administration spent several months trying to delegitimize or defraud the elections, even going so far as to sanction moderate opposition candidates. And he did this with the US elections as well. You know, he claimed they were a fraud in face of overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise, but he did this in the lead up to them, right? And Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, called the Venezuelans a political farce and a charade. But it's important to remember, and we had the opportunity to actually interact and interview some of the opposition and the opposition candidates while we were there in Caracas, that the moderate opposition candidates, like a majority of Venezuelans, opposed the sanctions that had been attributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, the migration of millions, both internally and externally from the country, and the daily immiseration of the poorest. But the opposition's proposed alternative of massive privatization, the rolling back the gains of the revolution itself and the economy, has few supporters. And that's why they lost the vote. It wasn't because of some kind of election fraud or anything like that. And I think it's important to even point out that after the elections, there's still faith in the democratic process in Venezuela and its institutions. The kind of what the U.S. focuses on in the media is actually the fringe activists and the right-wing fringe represented by somebody like Juan Guaido. But there was comments, and I got to interview some of people who were going to the elections, and this is a comment that kind of stuck out to me. Somebody told me it's easier to vote and get a PCR or a COVID test than it is to get a tank of gas. And I think that kind of sums up the turnout as well as people's views towards sanctions, right? Everyday necessities such as gas, food, even clean drinking water become imperiled by US sanctions. But even with the economic sanctions, the elected executive and legislative branches have a mandate to govern. And I want to talk a little bit about I think some people have kind of covered some of the topics, but I want to talk a little bit about how US intervention is related to not only the kind of Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, but also stems from a longer history of US settler colonialism within North America. So the old joke goes, why is there never a coup in the United States? Because there's no US embassy there. But US-backed coups are not confined to a heyday of foreign policy of a bygone era. In the recent cases of Venezuela and Bolivia, US embassies were entirely removed from the equation. The US embassy in Venezuela withdrew from the country after refusing to recognize the elected president, Nicolas Maduro, in 2019, and were expelled from Bolivia after they were caught resourcing fascist movements that attempted to assassinate and overthrow its elected president, Evo Morales, in 2009. Even without US embassies or direct diplomatic ties, US political pressure has only intensified to the degree of open hostility to each country's democratic processes. In the last 2 years, the United States tried to overthrow the elected leadership of Venezuela at least twice in two high-profile incidents. The first was an attempt to impose Venezuelan politician Juan Guaido, who the media depicted as an Obama-like figure. And I found out while I was there, the opposition actually picked him because he was like, he came from a poor background, which is up for debate. But he also was he resembled Obama to their eye, and perhaps to Trump's chagrin. They tried to promote him as the unelected president. And the second was a Bay of Pigs style operation that was planned at a Trump resort by Silvercorp, a US mercenary company, and was ultimately thwarted with the help of a group of socialist fishermen. Both plots were embarrassing failures, even as Trump and his Democratic foes in Congress, like Nancy Pelosi, rallied behind Guaido, who was relatively unknown in his homeland and outside it until declaring himself president in 2019. And more recently, Sidney Powell, former Trump campaign lawyer, blamed Trump's election loss on a voting machine conspiracy orchestrated by the dead Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez in cahoots with the current president, Maduro. This would all be comical if debilitating US sanctions and an economic blockade hadn't torn the country's economy apart by punishing the very people they're alleged to be saving, to say nothing of the constant threat of military intervention. In late October in 2019, I was in Caracas, again, for an international indigenous gathering. With our Venezuelan friends, we watched votes pour in for Bolivia's elections, clearing a path for an unprecedented fourth term for the nation's first indigenous president, Evo Morales, who was also the first union president, he liked to add. By chance, we met his former Prime Minister, David Checohuenca, who was then Secretary General of ALBA, the anti-neoliberal Latin American and Caribbean trade partnership that includes left and progressive governments. And we now know today he was the vice presidential candidate that won the most recent elections alongside Luis Arce. At that time, we congratulated his party's victory. A humble and deeply spiritual man, he invited our indigenous delegation to La Paz for an indigenous winter solstice ceremony for world peace. We never made it. And by the end of November, the police and military had forced Evo and his administration from power. Fascists and the golpistas, the coup plotters, burned huipalas, the indigenous Indian flag representing Pachamama, the Earth Mother, that was flown next to the country's tricolor banner in the streets. And the paper of record quickly claimed that it wasn't a racist coup that ousted Evo Morales. It was, according to the New York Times editorial board, quote, the arrogance of a populist who had steadily concentrated power in his hands, who was to blame. In other words, a power-hungry Indian overthrew himself. The toppling of the elected president was a setback, the Times admitted, but necessary to, quote, help Bolivia restore its wounded democracy, end quote. They echoed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's statement that the US-backed coup in Bolivia was essential for democracy, a widely held consensus among all political persuasions, even some so-called leftists in corporate media and both liberal and conservative politicians. Anyone familiar with indigenous history can see how the media and the US government's characterizations of somebody like Evo Morales and the project he represented are long-standing traditions of settler imperialism. For example, in December 1890, actually we're coming up on the anniversary of it soon, the Times described Sitting Bull, the famed Lakota holy man and resistance leader, as, quote, an accomplished liar and a wily old plotter who had desperately clung to power, to a political prestige he once enjoyed after resigning himself to reservation life. The elder medicine man's return to the reservation was a thorn in the side of the Indian agent and therefore the US government, who wanted to shore up the last pockets of indigenous resistance to Western expansion because he refused to quit being Indian, submit to police authority, and relinquish his status as a respected statesman of his people. In other words, he refused to accept the overthrow of a Lakota political authority by white overlords. Sitting Bull, a sympathizer to the Ghost Dance movement that spread like wildfire through the West, posed an acute threat, even though he was too old to be a soldier or a military commander. Indian police nonetheless surrounded the spiritual leader at his cabin with orders to, quote, according to the New York Times, to send the old medicine man to the happy hunting grounds should he attempt to evade capture. He was subsequently shot and killed in front of his family. The assassins, the Times wrote, quote, made a good Indian out of him without delay. It was a prelude of US military actions that made good Indians out of hundreds of mostly unarmed and starving Lakota ghost dancers at Wounded Knee weeks later. The message was simple: good Indians heal or get a Washington bullet. Sitting Bull's accusers claimed as a longtime resistance leader, he stood in the way of a new reservation political order. The taking up of the ghost dance, which prophesied the end of white colonialism, was seen as an attempt to break the back of a sense of militant independence that defined Lakota life. A generation earlier, when they killed Custer just days before the United States was set to celebrate 100 years of its independence. The extermination of the old ways and hostiles such as Sitting Bull was needed, whatever the cost, to advance a preordained project of manifest destiny to secure the land for white settlement and industry. And likewise, Evo Morales, the indigenous campesino leader, broke the Monroe Doctrine by restoring dignity to his indigenous majority nation and pursuing a fourth term as president, which would inevitably pull the country further from its orbit of US hegemony. His bold nationalization programs that redistributed wealth, resource wealth to the country's poorest, stood in the way of foreign mining interests. Only dynamite in the streets would change his mind or dislodge him, a 2007 State Department cable leak leaked by WikiLeaks predicted. So native rule is always, at best, tenuous, and at worst, chaotic and corruptible. White rule, on the other hand, invades to replace, and is forever and inevitable, we are told. The native inhabitants have proved themselves incapable of maintaining a respectable and responsible government. John W. Foster wrote of the Hawaiian Kingdom, which he helped overthrow as acting US Secretary of State in 1893, and, quote, lack the energy or will to improve the advantages which Providence has given the savages. These words became the unofficial motto of US foreign policy in the century to come, and no doubt became a lodestar for Foster's grandson, Allen Dulles, the first director of the CIA, who wrote the manual for regime change. And we know that Dulles went on to go topple Iran, Guatemala, etc. And while this is important, I want to return, because I don't have very much time, I want to return back to the indigenous elections and back to Evo Morales' talk in Caracas. I had the opportunity to actually witness the assembly elections in the southeastern state of Bolivar, which is in the Orinoco mining arc, an area that has been historically used to mine diamonds, uranium, as well as gold. Something that has been increasingly exacerbated by the sanctions, because oil workers have been massively laid off because of US sanctions, and have internally migrated to this region to participate in the illegal mining operations. And while outside, environmental organizations, but also inside environmental organizations criticize the Maduro government for opening this region up to mining, 90% of the mining operations, whether it's for gold or diamonds, are run by small illegal mining operations. And what has happened is the previous indigenous economies of ecotourism, which began to kind of spring up under the Chavez administration, have all but collapsed, have all but disappeared. And 80% of the workers in the mines have now become indigenous people, specifically Pemon people. And so it's presented a particular volatile situation, especially being on the border with Guyana as well as Brazil. And this has led to all kinds of violence internally within the indigenous communities, who most of them in this particular region that I visited openly identify and align themselves with the Chavista movement and the Bolivarian Revolution, identifying themselves as revolutionaries. And while the turnout for the national elections was 31%, nationally, the indigenous turnout was actually 50%. And in fact, the Bolivarian Constitution guarantees 3 permanent seats for indigenous people. And those were the seats that they were voting for. But in fact, indigenous people can run at large members. And so out of the 277 people who were elected to the National Assembly, 20 of them were indigenous, most of whom were actually indigenous women, and all of whom, for the three seats, were all indigenous women. And at this particular localized level, there exist overlapping governance systems that combine indigenous as well as more Western style forms of government and elections. And this is based on what Evo Morales had talked about in his speech, as well as Rafael Correa, a plurinational model, or at least an aspiration to a plurinational model, which is not liberal. It's not a liberal constitution. It's not the constitution that Roxanne pointed out at the beginning of this, one that requires a homogenous settler citizenship, but actually understands that equality cannot be achieved under capitalist liberal democracy. But in fact, difference needs to be respected and upheld. And it goes back to this idea of the dialogue of civilizations. And in fact, we can see that the coup in Honduras in 2009, orchestrated under the Obama administration, was an attempt to prevent Honduras from opening up a dialogue, a national dialogue, to adopt a plurinational model. And the most recent uprising in Guatemala, led by indigenous people, was actually for a plurinational constitution within that government. So these are not idealist aspirations for equality that ignore class struggle and colonialism, but in fact seek to rectify them through new ways of governance and new ways of being. And that's the legacy that these sanctions are targeting in places like Venezuela, in places like Bolivia. They're not targeting them for just because they hate people of color or because they hate indigenous people. It's because they actually represent an alternative to neoliberal capitalism. And to close out, I want to just finish with a quote from Evo Morales. He said, "There are only 2 civilizations on the planet," kind of evoking Fanon's Manichaean worldview between the colonizer and the colonized. There is the imperialist civilization, which is that of the invaders. And then there's the people's civilization, peoples with an S, right? And in that sense, he said, life is sacred. And the only system of governance that can achieve the sanctity of life is that of socialism.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. I truly, sincerely feel very grateful to be able to join you today and to hear from all of you. We have about 40 to 45 minutes for discussion. And I think that there are at least like 5 to 7 questions that are circulating in the Q&A box and in the chat box. And I think that, I'd like to start with a question that was put out by an anonymous attendee on the issue of like, how do we improve education on US imperialism? How do we bring analysis around US imperialism to a wider audience? As this attendee states, it seems that most Americans are not aware of the US's global military presence and participation in multiple coups throughout history. I kind of want to also connect this question to Stephen Zollman's question, which is what advice would we give movements like the Black Lives Matter movement or peace movements by veterans and others? And I also just want to connect this to something that Roxanne said, I think, around the closing of her presentation, which was that, that we can't build an anti-imperialist movement with the erasure of Indigenous history in US history, and there is a great responsibility on the left to address that. And I think that, speaking as somebody who's been in movement spaces since my teenage years, it really was many years until I came into a space where I was introduced to the Indigenous experience. And I'm wondering if you can start with this question and talk about, what this means, not just for Indigenous history, but, when we talk about anti-imperialist education, I also want to remind everyone that we're not all academics and we're not all engaging in academic spaces. A lot of us are organizing in our communities, in our working class communities. And, what are the different models that we've seen historically in the US and globally for us to widen analysis and critical mass around these issues?
I'll say something, Suzanne. Well, I think the problem, there's so many problems with teaching US history, because we have variations on a narrative, from left to ultra right, that actually have more in common than they do differences. In that there's a sense that the United States had ideals. I mean, they've been really good salesmen of the myth of the United States. Most of the world believes it. It's not just the United States. It's when I lived in England for a summer, I had a very hard time. Well, I don't think I succeeded. I was only, I was just a graduate and didn't know even what as much as I know now, but they were leftists who blamed the United States. In fact, of them were African National Congress in exile that I was working with, did not want to believe that the US wasn't a savior that's gone off the rails. So this is a real problem. It's so extensive, it's hard to know where to start, but I always start with the left, because I do think the left is the mover of, if anything's going to move, it's going to have to come from the left. And I don't think we're taking enough responsibility in the United States to tell the rest of the world what the United States really is and why they should beware under all circumstances. Because the other thing is that, you know, the Marxism, and I consider myself in that tradition, is Eurocentric. Everything that was being analyzed under Marxism-Leninism was Eurocentric. And, you know, the Chinese then introduced, shook up things with a whole different, you know, Maoism, which was an improvement because it considered peasantry in the countryside and so forth. But leftists in the United States, Marxian leftists, want to, you know, believe that the proletarian revolution in the United States is the objective. And they don't, you know, a working class under settler colonialism, and I learned this from people in the ANC about South Africa, is a very, you know, when there's racism involved, the white working class, they're almost always talking about the white working class and how to mobilize the left. And they don't understand that this access to property of the settler, even when settlers became coal miners, when they became industrial workers, they still could have this aspiration for property. So the only time we had a huge industrial labor movement and the formation of labor unions were in the 1880s, 1890s, and up to World War I. 99% of those were socialists, immigrants from Germany and Eastern Europe. Italian anarchists. They were not the, but they too got wrapped into, you know, they got Americanized. And our union movement went to a private business union model. And it's never come out of that. So those are, you know, the main impediments I see on the left in the United States of being able to, so what has really been revolutionary in the United States, it's brought a revolutionary aspect to class politics, is really the Black revolutionary movement. I myself see the original proletariat of the United States being enslaved Africans. That was the proletariat. And so if we, you know, start with a different kind of class analysis and try to build on the reality of the United States, we might get to the point we could understand then how to build a truly anti-imperialist movement and have an analysis of what class means in the United States.
Sorry, I was
Could
on mute.
I just add to that?
Please.
Could I add to that real quick? Yeah, I just wanted to suggest as well that, I mean, I think there's a number of different tasks that we face in terms of trying to kind of improve education around U.S. imperialism. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz mentioned a number of those, particularly in terms of the sort of narratives that exist around sort of the origins of the U.S. and its development. I think we also just have a real failure in terms of making the process of educating people about the history of U.S. imperialism and really the way in which it's fundamentally intertwined with the origins of the United States as a settler colony, that we really haven't taken it seriously, and that there really needs to be a robust project of not simply relying on the sort of mobilization and weak organization has been sort of the mainstay of a lot of the organizing in the US, much less to very little anti-war organizing that kind of currently takes place at this moment in time. But to really make an effort to involve and kind of take up this question of not just kind of political education, but ensure that it's done in a really practical manner. I mean, because I think it can have really kind of inspiring results. One of the best examples that I've seen of that kind of effort is when I was working with a group of comrades in Chicago, trying to deal with the way in which some of the efforts to respond to the devastating earthquake in Haiti in 2010 were deeply intertwined with U.S. imperialism and were mobilized through organizations like the Red Cross. And one of the things that we did, in addition to protesting the Red Cross and trying to highlight the work of grassroots organizations in Haiti to mobilize in response to the earthquake, is we actually took the time to go and do popular education around the history of Haiti and its relationship to U.S. imperialism. And I'll never forget going to classrooms in Chicago, being on the South Side, and talking to kids about the sort of long history of U.S. imperialism and the origins of Haiti. And, you know, having one of these young people come up to me afterwards and basically say that, so you're basically saying that Haiti is a Jamaican version of Chicago. And in many ways, I thought that was a stunning example of the ways in which, you know, I'd spent like 20 minutes going down all these different elements of historical developments, the Haitian Revolution, and what have you, and the ability to connect the struggles in Chicago that those young people themselves were dealing with, and the realities that they might not be very familiar with taking place in the Caribbean, and the best way in which they could associate that was through like Jamaica or what have you. And at least as an example of kind of what headway we could start to make if we have an opportunity to clarify, not just educate, but really clarify how flawed so many of those origins that sort of premise the realities of the United States as sort of like a failure to live up to certain principles, and really demonstrate that actually the origins of the United States and the current circumstances that we find ourselves in are much more rooted than a really devastating settler colonial project that's been able to maintain and perpetuate itself through a variety of different kind of permutations. And that reality, which is rooted in capitalism, rooted in slavery, rooted in heteropatriarchy and white supremacy, has been those have been fundamental factors in shaping the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. That's an important aspect of what we need to be doing. And, you know, this panel is a part of that. But part of what we also need to be doing is finding ways to engaging folks in the variety of different spaces that they find themselves in, even in the midst of the pandemic and afterwards, to really do that work that can help clarify and then help us better organize folks to challenge the way in which U.S. imperialism operates at home and abroad.
Thank you, Toussaint. I'm going to move on to another question, if that's okay with the panelists. I think we did notice that there were a couple of questions that were brought into the chat directed at Zhun, and there's one in particular that we wanted to uplift, and I'm going to ask Charlotte to do that.
Sure. Yes, we were very interested in this question, particularly because it implicates the issue of U.S. sanctions against Iran and the extraterritorial reach of U.S. law internationally, as well as the role of Canada in imperialist ventures in general, as well as, of course, in settler colonialism. This is a question from Listen Chen regarding anti-imperialist strategy in the West, noting that Canada arrested and detained Huawei's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, 2 years ago at the request of the United States over the allegations that she and her company, Huawei, violated sanctions against Iran. Her trial has exacerbated and legitimized anti-Chinese sentiment in Canada, and there have been objections from some leftists in Western Canada to denouncing Meng's trial from an anti-racist or anti-imperialist perspective, because they say that because she is a rich and powerful capitalist, to oppose her extradition does more to increase the power of Chinese capital than intervene in the consolidation of Canada's anti-Chinese nationalism. And what are your thoughts on this? Should we not oppose Western aggression when their targets are personally reprehensible or members of the capitalist class? And how do we center working class anti-imperialism when some forms of anti-elitism are constituent of xenophobia today, i.e. it seems to be a common sentiment amongst some parts of the left that xenophobia is tolerable if it's aimed at a rich Chinese person. Now, Zhun made some response to this in the chat already, but we'd really like to bring that to so that everyone can hear this discussion and engage with this case, because it is it's a symbolic case, but it's also an important legal case in a lot of ways because of the other issues that are implicated in it as well. So I don't know if you'd like to address this.
Thanks, Charlotte. First of all, I think the better response for from the left on this issue really depends on where you are, what's your location. For example, Huawei, this company, the big company, has long been something that the Chinese leftists have been very critical of, because it represents whatever the China dream. And it's the working condition in Huawei is really bad. It's really and it's not treating the workers, I would say, brutally. So there's nothing that we had sympathy with this particular company. So in China, I mean, the main focus of the leftists is to say that we don't stand with Huawei. We don't stand with this particular lady, that super rich person that got arrested in abroad. But I think in Canada, in the U.S., in the West in general, I think that there is other considerations here, because the very fact that she was arrested in Canada and was, as you said, it was long arm, this extraterritorial legal stuff. It was because the company was alleged to have transactions, it sell technology stuff to Iran, which violated the U.S. sanctions. I mean, that claim, that charge is ridiculous. If possible, we should never follow the U.S. sanction. We should sell things to Iran. So the fact that this person was arrested or was charged on this thing, I think it's something that the leftists here in the United States or in Canada should oppose to. And we don't have to be supporting this company because yes, I mean it's a capitalist firm. What kind of we don't have to be supportive of this particular person. But the thing that they think the U.S. or Canadian capitalists say, oh, this is so wrong, selling stuff to Iran, and that is something that we should definitely be very clear. Like, this is wrong, and whatever she has done, she should not be punished because she helped sell stuff to Iran. So that's something that I thought of. But overall, I mean, this is obviously a tricky issue. I think it's again, I mean, the U.S. capitalists for a long time, obviously they knew about this, they tolerated about this, and it was only recently that they thought, okay, we're gonna do something that show to the Chinese, the bureaucrats, the capitalists, or the whatever other people that if you don't follow our rules, we can easily anywhere in the world, we can arrest you and put you, in our jail. It's, this person is not particularly important, but there are many important, the relatives, children of the Chinese elites that live in Canada and the United States. And that's the real message. If you don't do what I say, look at this person. So that is definitely part of the U.S. imperialism. It's something that we at least we should be clear that this is not just simply a dog eating dog, a capitalist rivalry thing. It's really part of the U.S. hegemony, and it's something that we should be very critical of. So.
Thank you, Jun. Is there anybody else that wanted to address that question? Okay, so I'm now going to refer to a question that I received over text from Max Isle. And I think that while this is directed at Nick, that I think that it could be answered by any of the panelists. And the request was to discuss the sort of extractivist analyses that are common these days and their possible role in eroding support for the Bolivarian processes. And I think that this relates to a question that was also put in the Q&A box by anonymous attendee, which is referencing Morales. It seems that Morales is and has been pro-Indigenous rights and cosmologies, but as we have witnessed, his project in regards to defense of land and Indigenous rights does not correspond to what he has done in regards to mega projects. It seems that the solution rooted in the state are not enough, and instead to stop the process of colonization. Coming from a Latin American perspective, it seems that what is needed is the patriarchal decolonial perspective that has not yet been provided yet. So I hope it's okay that I combine those two questions, but I'm going to begin with Nick.
I think both of those questions are really good. I think I'll start with Venezuela and I'll talk a little bit about Bolivia. But I'll preface my comments with saying this, is that the Bolivarian government didn't create the oil extractivist project, right? Neither did the Bolivian government, but oftentimes these governments and these political processes get attributed to the extractivist process, and then also get blamed, as I think the second question kind of points out. And I'll give you an example for people in the United States who may not understand. I was at a recent we do a lot of outreach with a program that we have called the Red Deal, which is actually based on the 2010 People's Accords in Cochabamba. And one of the demands that we encountered a lot from Indigenous communities, especially rural Indigenous communities, was infrastructural development, building roads. But when we brought this proposal, like when we were discussing with other groups and other organizations, especially environmentalists, they were very appalled that Indigenous people would want cell phone towers and roads without understanding the fact. They were like, well, don't we want a post-carbon economy? Like, well, why do you want to build roads if they're just going to contribute to car culture and Indigenous communities? First of all, it's a racist statement because it assumes that Indigenous people just like to be without technology, and it assumes that development, is automatically bad, any kind of development. But it also it fails to actually understand the material conditions that there are, like Navajo Nation, where we were doing these community surveys, has less grocery stores per capita than the entire country of India, right? Like you can't get a fresh vegetable in most communities because of food apartheid, and because of colonization, right? And so people have to drive, and they have to, 1/3 of people live without electricity and running water. Should we disallow them? Those are both modern conventions. Should we deny them those conventions as well? When I was in the Pemon community in the South, that was another demand that they wanted. They wanted consistent electricity as well as a fresh running water into their communities. Partly that had to do with the fact that they had traditionally relied on the streams, but because of resource development, mercury poisoning prevented them from drinking the water anymore. And the question of extractivism is, you can't just like end. What do you know? I think there's actually there were some Chinese colleagues who were there, and they said you can't eat ideology, right? You can have the purest like thought process in the world, but how are you going to feed people? How are you going to meet the basic needs? And from what I understand from both processes, they're in a situation where they have more advantages that we do because they're actually in a revolution. We're not. We're like far away from it. We should be listening to them and not offering those kinds of views from afar from the United States, where we don't even have, we can't even get socialized medicine. We saw the massive retreat by all parties on the so-called left in the United States from basic things like socialized medicine or just Medicare for all. During a pandemic, when I think we're at 300,000 people have died, millions of people are facing eviction, right? And they have to make, they're not making decisions based on like pure ideology. They're making decisions based on like actually meeting material needs of people, right? While also understanding that there's a long-term vision. And right now, like the case with Evo Morales, we should be moving towards a post-carbon economy. And in that speech, she actually talked about how countries of the global north, like Germany and Japan, actively denied technology transfers for developing their own lithium because they didn't want value added in the commodity supply chain, so that the Bolivian government in their nationalization process could actually build lithium batteries to make electric vehicles and to transition away from a carbon economy. And like people speak out, oh, there was no lithium coup, but it was pretty evident, like those contracts that Evo Morales was negotiating with the Chinese corporations to actually add value, to create lithium plants and begin developing its own national lithium program. That was months before the coup was implemented, and the coup government actually tried to privatize those industries, right? But it couldn't do so because the global north only wanted it as a resource colony, right? And so we can have these these debates about whether or not what that kind of like transition looks like, but in the global north, we've colonized the atmosphere. No other country, no other nation on this planet can take the path, the industrial development path that this country took, because we would need 3 different planets. We'd need 3 Earths to sustain that amount of carbon emission. And right now, there's currently no plan in the Green New Deal that's coming from Europe, Canada, and the United States primarily that accounts for this, that accounts for the fact that there needs to be technology transfers, that the entire atmosphere has been colonized by the global north, and that the US government is still pressuring, to implement coups. And so in a place like Venezuela, 70% of their electricity comes from hydroelectric plants, not because of the Bolivarian Revolution, but actually because of prior administration. So in some ways, I wouldn't call hydroelectricity green energy, but it's definitely a lot better than the fossil fuel energy systems that exist. But also they can't even move away from that system because because of US sanctions. And so we have to ask the question, the extractivist model, yeah, we should be very critical of it from the places from the imperial core that are based on consumption models. And this was talked about in the 2010 People's Accord. It's not about elevating levels of consumption. Maybe it is when it comes to nutrition and water consumption. Those things are incredibly important. Billions of people still live in hunger in the world, right? Those are basic needs. How are you going to account for that? How are you going to feed your people? How are you going to keep fresh water? Those are problems that these countries are confronting when they de-link, when they attempt to de-link from the global imperialist supply chain, right? They're dealing with these things not as abstract realities or idealist realities. They're dealing with them as material, concrete realities where tens of thousands of people have already died because of US sanctions and because of US aggression, right? And so I think it's a little bit impractical to, say somebody like Evo Morales has deviated from the indigenous vision. What is the indigenous vision? I want to seriously, somebody tell me what an indigenous vision is, because apparently running water for my people or electricity contravenes that vision. But what they're proposing, and what I understand this model to be, is a different alternative model for social development that measures success not by the consumption process, but by the well-being, the social well-being of people. And we saw with the coup how drastically those 13 years in power had been reduced or had been reversed for everyday people, right? Who lived with dignity for the very first time. And you can even see this even within the Venezuelan process, and nothing's perfect, right? But people who even migrate away, all of a sudden they don't have subsidized housing, they don't have subsidized income or just basic necessities, and they're forced into a wage economy or neoliberal kind of structures that even prevent them from returning back to their home country. So I think it's incredibly important when we talk about extractivism and we talk about climate policy that we can't divorce it from the reality of imperialism and the role the United States plays in holding back the rest of the world from transitioning into whatever green economy that may be in the future. But in fact, the movements of the global South in places like Venezuela and Bolivia are actually leading the way. It's completely the reverse of the question that was asked in the second part. I would actually trust Evo Morales' perspective more on this than I would somebody like Joe Biden or anyone he appoints in his cabinet.
Thank you, Nick. I'd like to give any other panelists that want to touch on this question the opportunity to touch on this question as well. But I will let you know that I think that we're only going to also kind of put out there 2 other questions. After the panelists were done, the number of questions just kind of doubled, almost tripled, but unfortunately we can't address all of them. So what I'd like to do is just read those questions and then just go to all of you, and then you can choose which ones you'd like to address. And one of them is actually directed at Zhun and Navid. And it starts like this. It states that, in the region, there has developed 2 axes, one of empire and another of resistance. What George W. coined the term axis of evil contributed to that, that framework. And the question is, how much does the Iranian-Chinese relationship provide a counterweight to US-Israeli imperialism? And will China ultimately support the axis of resistance? The other question that I wanted to make sure that we included starts like this. I very much appreciate Nick's point, which I understand is defining a racial imperialism of sorts that is premised upon the exclusive sovereign capacity of the white Western world and the existential threat posed to humanity by any effective sovereignty exercised by indigenous and non-Western peoples. Of course, it is not an existential threat to humanity, but to a white Western dominated capitalism, which must maintain sovereign control over resources, or what Samir Amin has called the imperialist rent. Can Nick and other panelists comment on the limits of an anti-racism that does not address the sovereignty question? What I mean here is that anti-racism seems to be allowed by imperialism until it starts to unsettle the sovereignty premise. So we can speak of anti-racism if we are trying to fit into the settler state, but certainly cannot speak of it if it means defending Venezuelan sovereignty or Bolivian sovereignty or Chinese sovereignty. The question put directly is, what are the limits of anti-racism when it does not address the sovereign question on an international scale? So I just wanted to put those 2 questions out there, and then also remind you that if you also wanted to address the question on the extractivist framework, that you're open to do that too. And who'd like to start? And then we can close out after that. Who'd like to start?
I would like to hear Navid's comments, since he opened his opening quote actually kind of answered this question that was posed to me.
Well, in terms of, so I'll try to address the Iran-China question, particularly from the Iran perspective. And I kind of want to bring into this question as well, like the role of Palestine and how we understand, Palestinian liberation within the framework of imperialism and anti-imperialism. Because I think in order to, really consider Iran's role in the region, we have to bring Palestine into the discussion. And in that respect, I think it's important to understand the one way that I would frame Iran's role vis-a-vis Palestine is something like a frontline state, like in Southern Africa in the battle against apartheid. So I think Iran positioned itself in a way to support, the Palestinian people in similar ways, and different but similar ways, like Angola was supporting the ANC, particularly Umkhonto Wesizwe, and SWAPO in Namibia, right? So I think that in that respect, Iran has positioned itself as as part of the resistance against empire, but specifically when it comes to the question of Palestine. And then when it comes to its relationship with China and on the other side, I think we need to understand that Iran is navigating a global context in which sanctions are really limiting its ability to maneuver, right? So whatever actions that it takes, like in terms of Chinese investment in the country, we have to understand it within the framework of empire, because if we don't, we run into dangerous culturalist and racial frameworks, really Orientalist frameworks about what's happening in Iran. And I think that, again, thinking about the question of empire, right? Thinking about, okay, this is what sanctions are doing to the Iranian people, and this is how the Iranian state needs to respond, right, to the destabilization attempts. We have to, think of the Iran-China deal in that framework. So, yeah.
Zhun, do you want to comment?
I'll just be very brief. I think that on the question of Palestine, for example, that China did retreat a lot from its older positions. I mean, that for a long time, China didn't even recognize Israel, but in 1992, it finally recognized Israel as, as a country, and starting doing trade and other business with them. I think the recent history suggests that the closer the U.S. and China are, then the less support that China might give to other global South countries. We can see this from the case of North Korea. We can see this from Vietnam and a number of other places. And now I think with the U.S. actively doing this aggressions against China, that might push China to pursue a more a global South-oriented international policy, give more real support. So that's something might be realized in the future.
Anyone else want to comment either on this question of the axis of resistance or the limits of anti-racism, or anything that you feel you want to share before the panel ends?
I'll try to tackle the anti-racism question really quick as well.
Okay.
I think the question of sovereignty is very important when it comes to anti-racism. But I think embedded within the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, is, are we thinking about like anti-racism as also anti-colonial nationalism? Or are we thinking about anti-racism within the framework of existing states, right? Like, so it's hard to say where to position myself on that in the framing of that question. But I will say that any anti-racism that doesn't take the capitalist accumulation into consideration isn't really a true anti-racism. But at the same time, like, we need to understand questions of sovereignty and of capitalist accumulation in terms of its relationship with how Black and brown people of the world and indigenous people in the world over have been exploited, how their lands have been, how they've been dispossessed of their lands. And I think a lot of times the question about, sovereignty and capital accumulation doesn't take that aspect of it into consideration as well. So I think we need to think of it in both ways.
Thank you.
I'll say something about anti-racism, and in particular anti-Chinese. I just finished a book in which I have a whole chapter that I ended up calling, in quotation marks, Yellow Peril. You've probably heard that term, but it's a real thing. I had no idea actually how far back it went to Marco Polo. I mean, in medieval Europe, the exoticizing, and it, it wasn't just China, it's all of Asia, Arab people, Iranian. There's this, in the West, a mortal fear, and just geographically, if you look at it, there's no such thing as a European continent. There's just this little peninsula of Asia that they call Europe, and it kind of rules the world. And the US incorporated this, this really deranged view of Chinese. So you can imagine when the Chinese workers came to work on the railroad, or first to the gold rush, but then especially to work on the railroad. In California, I mean, reading about the state I live in, it's not my home state, I come from Oklahoma, but I thought I knew California history pretty well. It is so deep and impermeable that it made me much more concerned about the present and these chords of racism that's so inherent in the culture that we don't even notice it. So this is the, I think, a part of our anti-imperialist work has to ground itself also in this baggage of anti-racism that, or racism that is so, is not, I mean, it's economically based, of course. They wanted the wealth. I kept wondering, why these founders kept talking about China. When I started this thing about, understanding US imperialism myself, they kept talking about getting to China. They didn't really care about taking Mexico. They just wanted to get to the Pacific and get to Asia. And that's where the great wealth of humanity, that's where, 3/4 of humanity and all the resources exist. So Western imperialism, to a great extent, is inherently anti-Asian. And I think we have to confront that, because I see it in a lot of people on the left as well. This fear of China, that where's it coming from? And every time I argue with it, they say, well, it's not socialist anymore. And I said, well, it's still, the US doesn't have the right to dominate it. I don't care if it's, if it's totally capitalist, which is not exactly totally capitalist. So I do think that's a big issue that we really have to deal with. And I think that soon that I don't think it just started yesterday. It pops up, it gets more extreme all the time, but there is and also the United States was imperialist in China in the late 19th century. They were absolutely in the leadership of the Bund in Shanghai. The takeover of that district simply took it over for Europe. It's mainly banking, but the US and Britain were the leaders of it. So imperialism in China goes way back.
Thank you, Roxana. I'm gonna now give the floor to Toussaint and Nick also if they have closing remarks. I'm just going to have to ask Charlotte to take over facilitation for me. Sorry, I have a worker meeting I have to get to. But it's been amazing, and I'm looking forward to actually reviewing the video because I didn't get to pay as much attention as I would like to as moderator. But thank you all very, very much, and thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you for your excellent facilitation and for dedicating your time to grounding this conversation today and leading it forward. So we'd love to move forward to hear those final comments from Toussaint, from Nick, from the remaining panelists, and wrap up today. We know there are so many amazing and important questions. Some of you have been putting these in the chat. That's great. We want to encourage you, please do that. Please use that forum because we do have probably 3 times as many questions as we've been able to address today. So we'd love to hear those final remarks. Thank you again.
Sure. Yeah, and I don't think she's here any longer, but definitely wanted to pass on those thanks to Suzanne for her wonderful job. I wanted to touch briefly on the sovereignty question because I felt like it's already been, Navid touched on it, and I think some important points were raised. I also wanted to just highlight that the concern that I have is I feel like the question of sovereignty obscures the point slightly. And this kind of goes a little bit to what Roxanne was speaking to, but it's important to recognize that beyond simply the question of sovereignty, that it's important to ground an understanding of anti-racism in a broader framework of colonialism and imperialism, and really to understand the way in which racism operates as a characteristic phenomenon of those systems. Nick mentioned Frantz Fanon earlier, and Fanon does a wonderful job of attempting to analyze anti-Black racism in his first book, and in the second book, really, Enriched of the Earth, really does this amazing job of actually grounding the question of racism, the treatment of the native, and the sort of broader dynamics of how anti-Black, anti-African racism works in the structures of colonialism and imperialism. And so I think it's imperative for us to, especially with us having this panel and this discussion, particularly regarding how anti-imperialists can stand in solidarity with Iran, to really take seriously the question of how we analyze, attempt to make sense of the way in which U.S. imperialism operates at this moment in time, and how, again, both sort of domestically and internationally, we see racism functioning as a phenomenon of this larger system. And I just want to offer that in part because we've seen even this summer with the rise of the mass mobilizations under the banner of Black Lives Matter, the way in which there's been a promotion of a kind of anti-racism that's really sharply disconnected from a broader systemic analysis. And there's an anti-racism that's just about forms of stereotyping and bias that doesn't necessarily move beyond the ways in which individuals, or in some small instances, the sort of cultures and behavior patterns that can manifest themselves in different institutions, the way in which those operate, but as in a very kind of liberal and sort of almost kind of bourgeois way. It's a discussion of anti-racism that doesn't touch on the broader system of capitalism, doesn't talk about the long and kind of ongoing phenomenon of colonialism, and really has no appetite for discussions about imperialism. And I think it's important for us to kind of move beyond a very surface way of talking about anti-racism and to think about questions of sovereignty, particularly in the context of imperialism in large part, and we see this in a very fundamental way when it comes to AFRICOM. There are many different instances where the United States is willing to respect the sovereignty of other countries, but it's in large part the way in which those countries are willing to support and to kind of undergird the sort of projects that the U.S. is looking to carry out, that we see the question of sovereignty being upheld. It's just kind of this push for really engaging anti-racism on that plane of the discussion of imperialism. I think it's worth taking into account.
I think Toussaint and Roxanne covered the points pretty well. I would only add that, there is, global division of humanity that often falls along racial lines, but also geopolitical lines. And so the question of sovereignty, I think, is incredibly important when thinking about those questions, but also that, the attempts to, deviate from U.S. imperialist aims or aspirations often, as Roxanne pointed out, put countries like China, squarely within these kind of like racial logics that the U.S. uses to kind of control its own population, and then impart that upon the world. It doesn't necessarily make for good politics all the time in how we interpret the world, but it's important to understand that that's kind of the logic of rule that's being exported, as well as to Toussaint's point, in that we have like one of the most, we're going to have one of the most diverse political ruling classes probably in history. And we actually, we have to understand that race and class cannot be separated, either within the kind of sovereign state of the settler state or within a kind of international arena. And I think it's going to be increasingly imperative, as I think Toussaint pointed out, to be critical and to be challenging these attempts to diversify and to create, dividends of profit for the political classes through the inclusion of different people. I think we're going to see that more and more as a way to temper and to bat down, movements from below in the United States, but also in the global South. It's like we have a quote unquote Latino, director of Homeland Security. It's like, that's the funniest thing in the entire world if you think about it. But it's a totally cynical politics at the end of the day. It's like, would you rather have a Latino exporting and imprisoning children, or would you rather have, a white person doing it? But the system remains the same. And I think, we should all go back and read Frantz Fanon for this particular moment to understand the role of the, this would be in some ways considered a form of neo-colonialism, even though we haven't had a successful national liberation movement in the so-called United States. These attempts to use, colonize people or people of color as essentially prison guards, or not prison guards, as administrators of the colonial settler project, both abroad and at home, needs to be challenged and questioned. We can't just have brown faces or black faces in high places. We know that's not going to change anything, but nonetheless, it's been a very incredibly counterinsurgency tactic that's used to demobilize and delegitimize social movements.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, really quick to add to Nick's point as well. Empires and repressive regimes have leveraged the point of sovereignty to further their causes historically as well, right? So, like, for example, in South Africa, the apartheid regime leveraging the position of ethnic groups, particular ethnic groups, to undermine the broader struggle against apartheid. The U.S. government, supposedly supporting the cause of ethnic or religious minorities in particular countries that it opposes on a political basis in order to leverage its own interests and justify intervention, for example. So that's just another point to complicate the question of sovereignty.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all of our distinguished and brilliant and engaged panelists, and to all of the thoughtful attendees with so many great questions who are giving their time, both panelists and attendees, to be with us today, despite being active and engaged organizers, activists, mobilizers, people that are engaged every day, both in building a scholarly, battle against imperialism, but against the discourse of imperialism, but also engaged in building movements to stand up against imperialism, to fight back against colonialism, racism, capitalism, and all forms of exploitation. So thank you once again to all who participated, and of course, thank you to Suzanne for her facilitation of this event. We just want to remind everybody before you leave that this event it has been recorded. It will be posted on YouTube. It is currently on Facebook. The link is in the chat. It will be posted on the CASI website at solidarityiran.org, and we encourage people to visit the website and to sign up there to join the email list. And send us an email if you'd like to get more involved and learn more about CASI's work and how we can work together to continue to build this critically important fight back against imperialism, and to stand with peoples of the world and with movements that are fighting back against imperialism and building sovereignty and resistance against all of these repressive forces that are attempting to suppress it. So thank you once again for being with us today. And thank you once again to Roxanne, Navid, Nick, Toussaint, and Zhun for all of your insightful and brilliant comments. And we look forward to seeing you once again in the halls of the Academy and on the streets in the struggle for justice and liberation. And yes, just one more comment before we go, that the audio of this episode will also be available soon on the East is a Podcast. So we encourage everyone to check out the East is a Podcast, to share many of the wonderful episodes of this podcast, but also the forthcoming episode here. If you'd like to share this with other people that you know, the podcast is a great way to share all of the insights that you heard today. So thank you again. That episode of the podcast will be coming out tonight, and this video will also be posted on YouTube and on the CASI website later tonight. So thanks again once more to everybody, and long live international solidarity, long live the struggle against imperialism, long live the peoples in struggle. Thank you to all.